Hey everyone, welcome to the last day of Altitude. I hope you have all been leveling up your SaaS ops skill set, you've been meeting with your peers, and you're overall having a great virtual conference. So I'm so excited to have this session with you all and close it out. Today, we're talking about the topic of powering zero trust for file security in the SaaS-centric world. When I told my mom I was speaking at a virtual event with Steve Wozniak and Rainn Wilson, her first question was, can you please get me their autograph? The second question she asked me is, wait, what exactly are you talking about? I've heard those words before, but I never heard them in that order. Luckily, I am surrounded by the SaaS ops pros in the world who know a bit more about data governance, file security, insider threats, and the rise of SaaS. So I'm sure this will be more relevant for you than for my mom. My name is Devin Domingo, and I am a product manager here at BetterCloud who wants to solve the problem of bringing order to the chaos of SaaS data security. I previously worked on BetterCloud's expert advisory group and solved SaaS ops implementation problems, and previously worked as an IT manager and admin. A quick overview of what you can expect out of today's talk. First, I'd love to tell you a bit of a background in the form of a story of what I've seen in my consulting days. Then I'd love to talk a little bit about the data behind it, and is this really that widespread of a problem? And then after that, let's talk about how BetterCloud Secure fits into your security toolkit when it comes to monitoring your data governance within SaaS. And I want to talk about some of the improvements we made to some of our features to help you get closer to that zero trust dream when it comes to your SaaS data. So I'd love to tell you a story from the field of when I was an expert advisor with BetterCloud. So picture it, I'm on a consulting call with a nonprofit security and IT director who really just wanted to learn, how is my staff sharing sensitive data in Google Workspace, right? They were really just interested in this realm of understanding if there was kind of leaks in the sense of were their staff or were their employees sharing out any personal information when it comes to public links, when it comes to unsafe third-party sharing, if the content of those documents specifically contain things like personally identifiable information terms like addresses or phone numbers, contact information, social security numbers. Also, another thing to keep in mind too with this organization is they're specifically under like HIPAA guidelines. So anytime that they don't demonstrate that they have the ability to identify this information or they have no controls or protocols to save them from this, they could be fined up to $50,000 in kind of the worst case scenario, right? So we use BetterCloud essentially to generate what's called a file audit. And what that does is that scans all their Google Drive documents and information, all the public links, all the externally shared Drive files, and looking specifically for all those PII terms, right? So essentially, we're looking for this concept of a leak, right? How many times or which files have accidentally leaked out that info? So we start to get our results back from that leak. And this is a good representation of us looking through the report. And we look at the top results of the report. And this is our reaction when we find out that the director of HR had a folder sharing out all of these social security numbers publicly with the internet. We really fine-tuned, like we looked through those results and we find out it was coming from the director of HR. There were a good number of files in there, like the president's social security number, the vice president's. Ultimately, we knew this was a HIPAA violation the minute that we saw it, right? So this is another representation of probably what everybody looked like when they had to disparage that news internally. And then ultimately, they spoke with the director of HR, trying to pull this back in, and we needed to patch that leak essentially. So we used BetterCloud as a SaaS management platform to not only discover that exposure, but also ultimately protect that information, take off those public links, and no longer have this organization under a HIPAA compliance issue. So that was a great outcome, I think. And ultimately, one thing that I wanted to understand was, is it really just this customer where this happens? Is this something that's really affecting the entire market, right? So we looked across the entire customer base to see if this is really just a common trend. I started as broadly as possible. I wanted to see how many public files there were that lived on the BetterCloud platform as a whole. And what we found is there is 67.4 million public files that may be living out there, according to at least what we could see with their current customer base. On average, that's maybe about 2.2% of any given customer tenant's amount of files. Now, you're probably already thinking like, well, this isn't inherently bad in all cases, right? Sometimes your content marketing team needs to host documents on the company website. Or maybe the product team has to send out like a public survey. I'm sure there's like other scenarios where your colleagues needed to collaborate on a document with another third party who didn't have access to Google Workspace, or they didn't have access to Dropbox. And you wanted to make that collaboration experience easy for them to use the tools. So in all cases, it isn't necessarily inherently a bad thing. But in this case, maybe we're just talking about those cases where there's company sensitive data, and we want to identify those cases. So we did another data drill down here, and we wanted to look for files that contain confidential somewhere in the file name or internal in the file name, right? What if it is truly a business confidential file or something that's required for internal use only? I'd love to do a quick poll here in the chat, and I'll give everybody like 30 seconds to think about this question as I ask it. And I would love to see what your responses are in chat. How many out of our entire BetterCloud customer base, when we look at a public and externally shared files, how many files do you think we found that contain the keyword confidential or internal in it? Is it 4.4 million? 404,000, 40.4 thousand, or 4,004 files? The Jeopardy music could be cued now. Give everybody a minute, 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds. I'm not counting actual time. I'll tell you what the answer was. It was 404,000 files found, which is, I was very, very surprised by this result. I wanted to do like another exercise of that. Like, let's look at that other set of the 67.4 million. How many of those contained the word password somewhere in that file name, right? That number was 229,000. And remember, I'm just looking at file names. I'm not looking anywhere within the content of these files. I'm sure that this number could only grow if we start making that even a more granular result. So I would say, given these estimates, when you start to look at like all of those exposed files, so that like 2.2% of all of your file estate, you probably estimate somewhere between 2 to 5% of that could potentially contain something that is sensitive in nature or potentially damaging publicly. So this is a pretty widespread problem. And we also, obviously these are all subject to an area where you could be data breached, right? This is something that is an existing insider threat within your organization. We understand that like an overwhelming majority of the people that are using your files today, they aren't bad actors. They may have a tendency to overshare these files. We don't think they're intentionally doing this in the majority of cases. And it's very rare though that you'll have these file owners or these data owners essentially go back to these files and make a decision about, hey, should we even be exposing this data still or going forward in the first place? So I also wanted to look at a couple of numbers around like, how often is this problem happening in the market when it comes to insider threat, right? There was a recent report done by the Ponemon Institute in partnership with IBM that basically revealed what the average cost is of a company data breach. So if I knew nothing about your industry, if I knew nothing about how many users you were managing, if I knew nothing about the kind of data governance and your compliance practices, on average, a company could expect to spend about $4.24 million essentially when they are data breached. Now, organizations that do employ mitigation factors or have some way to represent in court, saying that, hey, we have these tools that detect these data breaches or have some way to pull this in those measurements, they could expect to save 1.25 to 1.49 million if they could prove in the court that they have some sort of proactive threat detection and tools that help them resolve data breaches. There was another report that was put out by the Verizon 2021 data breach investigation, where we wanted to look at like the occurrence of data breaches and how often is it kind of precipitated by bad actors, right? And what we found is out of all data breaches that occur, 22% of them are caused by insider threats. So these calls come from inside the house and effectively are the source of those internal data breaches, right? So this makes up a smaller percentage, but we also wanted to pull that, pull this data back a little bit further and talk about how much of that is coming from malicious insiders, of which 62% are caused by non-malicious causes. So these are negligence-based. And maybe about 14% of that is around malicious intent. So when I say malicious intent, that 14% is essentially a disgruntled employee that wanted to pull like their contact record and take it with them, let's say to the next job. Or maybe they were a disgruntled help desk employee and leaked passwords out publicly to the company. So that way they would open up all these threats. But the majority of this is that 62%. This is happening in those cases where the director of HR accidentally publicly shared out a folder and forgot to take that off. So we're seeing that this is what's making up the majority of this whole issue about insider threat. And given this data, it's one of those pieces that you'll have to consider when you're trying to move closer to the zero trust framework with your SaaS data oversharing in order to reduce your risk of having one of these breach events. Now, let's talk about zero trust as a whole, right? Many of this room has employed zero trust already in their organization. And when it comes down to zero trust, like what does that even mean? It's really this concept of when it comes to your users or your devices, you're employing this strategy of don't trust that user, do not trust that device, but always make sure that you have a step that verifies we know who this person is, and we know that this device is within compliance. And when you're working within a SaaS first perimeter, like a network without any perimeter, you know that this principle becomes significantly more difficult to enforce. You want to verify your users are actually the users who they say they are. And you've made many projects in your organizations to achieve this by requiring all your users to do things like multi-factor, using end user education by your yearly security and compliance training, creating access controls based off their network zone and region, and many other ways that ultimately ensure that you and that person using that device, you could trust them. You're also employing many other projects like making sure that anytime a device gets compromised, or revoking access to that device to any sort of network shares. You've also put in things like phishing reporting and phishing device training. So that way, your users know how to report phishing attempts as they happen and how to look out for it. So I know you've already moved a lot on the needle when it comes to these security projects. Now, what about the zero trust framework when it comes to your SaaS data, right? You have things like departed employee files being transferred to your manager so they could own and manage some of that data. You're looking at things like your Dropbox files being shared between your marketing teams and their third-party design contractors and more. There's a lot of these smaller concepts when it comes to monitoring that sensitive data, things like making sure you know the moment that sensitive data gets shared. You want to employ things like object character recognition, so you could read those PDFs that may contain sensitive data. Maybe you're managing allow and block lists today, where you're saying which third parties are safe to share with and which third parties are not safe to share with. Really, the key to zero trust is turning a lot of that insight into action through these automated policies, through end user education, and having a tool like BetterCloud to help with some of that identification and remediation. We want to be a piece of that security portfolio and want to get you one step closer to that zero trust data security framework. And you could rest assured, like many of our customers, that their sensitive SaaS data is visible and secured. BetterCloud is the G2 and Gartner recognized leading SaaS management platform with many use cases that will help you discover, manage, and ultimately secure your SaaS data. When you look at our data security capabilities, our primary use cases focus on reporting and automation when looking for that sensitive data, and then learning, focusing on keeping things like your admin counts within reason, those files ultimately not publicly or externally exposed that are sensitive, and making sure that you're staying compliant within frameworks like SOC and HIPAA and CCPA and GDPR. With their file exposure management capabilities with things like the files grid, a living searchable dashboard that looks at the exposure of your Google Workspace, Dropbox, Box, Slack, OneDrive, and SharePoint. You pair this data with BetterCloud content scanning for things looking for credit cards, socials, passports, driver's licenses, keywords, and other custom data types. Ultimately, we're helping you automate that file exposure monitoring with alerts and associated workflows to bring in all that sensitive data back internally into the organization, affording your team back the time, reducing your organization's risk, and ultimately getting you closer to that zero trust model with your SaaS data exposure. So with that, I'd like to explore how we've improved about our BetterCloud Secure module when it relates to our file audits, our scan conditioning, and our alerts and workflows, and how we've made those improvements to make your team more secure and more efficient. BetterCloud has made major investments to file audits this year. For those that have not used file audits before, you'll be able to discover sensitive documents publicly or externally exposed across Google Workspace, OneDrive, SharePoint, Slack, Box, and Dropbox within a single report. Simply by selecting your integrations, your exposure level, and many of our nearly 100 sensitive expressions, as well as the ability to make your own custom data types, BetterCloud will scan the content of your exposed documents for personally identifiable information. You'll receive a single report that allows you to further investigate those risky documents and take action. We understand that the change management and the sensitivity around involving your data owners in the security response can be scary, but we do want to make sure you have that power of that data insight to customize your own response. So with that, we've introduced improvements, including the ability to export the results of your file audits this year. This unlocks your data to create your own custom reports on those insider threats, such as being able to surface who owns that file, who it's shared with, and what sensitive data was found. With that granularity in the reporting, you'll be able to involve things like which third-party emails and which domains were those sensitive files shared with. And you could even more deeply assess risky data shared with everyone from your partners, your consultants, and even the more dangerous cases like things like files shared with gmail.com and Yahoo. We've also introduced any and all conditioning for your file audits. You can combine data expressions together to get a more accurate and narrow set of results associated with those sensitive documents. For example, you could use an all condition to combine terms like your person names, socials, and emails to better identify your sensitive customer and employee forms that may be living within your documents. Or perhaps your team is getting a bit exhausted from all the manual auditing that your credit card matches are finding. And maybe you want to use an all condition that combines your credit card scan with the keyword credit to get a narrow set of results. By making more advanced combinations and customizations of your file audits, you'll increase your team's efficiency and reduce those false positives, and more readily find those security risks by finding the most pertinent data that may be exposed within your files. Once your team has started remediating and using file audits to their advantage to identify those risks living today within your scans, you can then start to take advantage of our go-forward content scanning alerts and workflows to proactively notify your security team of any violations. Across Google, Box, Dropbox, Slack, and OneDrive and SharePoint, you can publish custom alerts that look for publicly and externally exposed SaaS assets and filter those on by file names, sharing settings, and the sensitive content that's being found. This will give you a dashboard essentially for any time we find these files with these sensitive data terms in your triggered alerts view. And then from those results, you can take remediation actions or run workflows on demand that pull back those sharing settings and notify your file owners about the exposure. Many of our customers are familiar with the time savings that they've gotten through our workflows as they automate the most menial tasks of enforcing your insider threat program. Once your team has gotten comfortable running remediation actions on demand for your file exposure alerts, you can create and publish a workflow that automates that remediation. That will then save your security team time with automated approvals to those asset owners. You'll have actions that remove those public links automatically, and you can send messages in the Slack channel to keep your team up to date on those remediations. Now, one thing I'm very excited to talk about here is about something that is going to be coming soon to BetterCloud. We believe that in order to really discover exposure risks in your SaaS environment, you have to increase the range of what you could scan for. We believe that many of you are using Google Workspace as your primary integration. About 73% of our customers today knows this as their primary integration within BetterCloud. In fact, when I looked at our content scanning jobs, it makes up about 46% of all of our go-forward content scans. With that, I'm very pleased to say that there is a major enhancement coming to our #1 most requested feature in the SaaS Ops community. We're excited to announce a major improvement to one of our beta programs, specifically Google Shared Drive. I'm excited to say that we'll be adding content scanning of Google Shared Drive to our beta program. With that, you could target specific shared drives and scan them as part of your file audits. Many organizations we know are rapidly embracing shared drive for their collaboration due to their ease of permission management and team assignment with that comes with the risk associated with owning all these Google shared drives. So we're excited to say that you could start to identify those risks living within shared drive. So with explosive growth in your employee adoption of SaaS comes an ever-increasing risk of your SaaS data, potentially exposing your company's most sensitive information in the form of public links. Consider a costly compliance fiasco with a tool like BetterCloud Secure Module. It'll help you granularly identify those sensitive data exposures, using tools like our file audits to establish your baseline of risk, alerts to capture those risks going forward, and workflows to automatically remediate and notify you and your team about those breaches. Speak to your BetterCloud customer success manager about BetterCloud Secure and make a commitment to protect the identities of those who love and contribute to your organization by protecting your best-in-breed SaaS tools with BetterCloud. And we will help you reduce those risks in your company's favorite SaaS tools and reduce those insider threats. So with that, I really want to thank you so much for your time in today's session. And I hope Altitude 2021 has been the best it's ever been for you. Thank you and goodbye.